What's up, everybody? Charlie Marlow here. Want to talk a little history on the channel. Just started reading this book called Putin. There you go, Putin, by Philip Short. Picked it up at the Kirkwood Public Library the other day. First time in a while I've been actually reading a book instead of just reading on my phone. So it's nice to have the actual book in your hands. Pretty big book, about 700 pages. I'm only about 70 pages in, but I thought it would be interesting to read and learn more about, let's be real, the madman, Vladimir Putin, who's causing so much craziness right now with the war in Ukraine. And so this book by Philip Short, I'll read you real quick just about the author. I'd never heard of him before this. But Philip Short has written several definitive biographies, including Mao, A Life, and Pol Pot, Anatomy of a Nightmare. So he's writing about some bad dudes. He earlier had a long career as a foreign correspondent in Moscow, Beijing, and Washington, D.C. for the BBC, The Economist, and the Times of London. Born in Britain, Short now lives in southern France with his family. So that's the author, Philip Short, who wrote this book, Putin. I've probably held it up too many times, but you get the point. All right, so I think what's really interesting about this book, especially if you love history, and I do. By the way, I went to Bradley University. I studied radio TV. That's what I've done my entire career. Sports on TV, now sports on radio, doing all the YouTube. But I've always loved history. History has always been my favorite subject, going back to elementary school, high school, college. I was going to minor in history in college. But once I got to be, I think, a sophomore or junior and realized I had so many credits I could get a double major, I figured might as well go ahead and get the double major just because it was my most enjoyable classes. My most enjoyable classes were always the history classes. So to me, that was the most fun part about learning in college. Much more interesting, for the most part, than my broadcasting classes. So if you like history, if you like history of World War II, everything post-World War II with the Red Scare and United States-Soviet relations, United States-Russian relations, this book is really interesting. And I also think it really speaks to learning about the environment that Vladimir Putin grew up in and the environment his parents grew up in. And we'll start there. So I'm going to read you a quick passage. This is about the Siege of Leningrad, which was 1941 when the Germans blockaded the Soviets at Leningrad. So here it is. Vladimir Putin grew up in a city more deeply scarred by the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War, as Russians usually call it, than any outsider can begin to comprehend. For Americans in particular, whose country has never been invaded by a hostile power, and even for Western Europeans who saw cities like Coventry, Dresden, and Warsaw reduced to rubble, it is hard to grasp the enormity of what happened during the Leningrad blockade. After Hitler's troops surrounded the city in September of 1941 with orders not to occupy it, but to let the population starve. 750,000 Leningraders perished, most of them in the famine winter of 1941-1942, when Putin's brother Victor died. Now, Putin's brother Victor would have been his older brother, so Vladimir Putin obviously never met him. He died right during that initial siege of Leningrad. So the ration for dependents was reduced to a few ounces of ersatz bread a day, and the death toll, which again is 750,000, that's the people that starved, by the way. Way more when you bring in the military deaths, because this blockade and this battle lasted all the way till 1944. But the death toll of 750,000 people, that's 4 times the death toll in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, and 35 times more than in the London Blitz. In this one Russian city, more people died than all the Americans who have died in every foreign war the United States has ever fought. Now, knowing a lot about World War II, but I'd never heard specifically about the Siege of Leningrad, and you start to think about military tactics and how awful war is. That's an obvious statement. War is hell. And the Holocaust, clearly what was going on in Nazi Germany during World War II. But then to think also about how the Nazis strategized to defeat the Soviets during this siege was to starve them out. That was their military strategy. And I read more about this after I read about this in the book. I started going online, and you have Nazi German scientists that are doing their research to figure out how to best starve out a population. And that's just so crazy when you think about it like that. That was their intention of how to win this particular battle. And I'm reading this book, and then I'm reading more about the Siege of Leningrad, and you realize how desperate people are. When you see hundreds of thousands of people around you starving to death in the streets, and there are stories about people hurting each other, attacking each other, killing each other for their ration cards to get more bread. Stories of cannibalism, where people are resorting to cannibalism with dead bodies and also other people murdering people to eventually eat them. This is not something I'm making up. You can look all this up during the Siege of Leningrad. I mean, families and mothers having to make these crazy decisions of how to feed their kids, in essence, having to sacrifice one child to feed the other children. This is what actually went down during the Siege of Leningrad in that first winter. Well, all throughout it, but that first winter was the worst of 1941 into 1942. So when I just read all that, you learn, and it speaks to what Putin's parents had to do just to survive. So Putin's mother and father both survived that. When all those people died and all of that craziness and desperation is going on, I mean, that's the environment that Putin's parents grew up in. And Putin's older brother obviously didn't survive it as a child. Vladimir Putin is born 10, 11 years later in 1952. But that's the environment he was from. That's what his parents had to go through to survive that initial siege of Leningrad. And also, you think about war and how we look at different strategies and the awfulness of the Holocaust and things like the Bataan Death March. And you just realize that the Nazi strategy was to literally starve out this population of people. And it worked for several years. Now, the Soviets eventually won this battle in 1944 and won the war with the help of the United States, obviously. You're talking about different fronts here. But another thing is, when you think about deaths in World War II, just overall, and the fact that the Soviets, depending on what numbers you're looking at, anywhere from 20 to 27 million deaths for the Soviets in terms of civilians and the military population. That's just absolutely crazy when you look at the numbers and the fact that the Soviets experienced way more deaths than any other country. I don't remember exactly what the United States was. I looked this up a couple months ago for something else. I think it's around 500,000 people total. So, and correct me if I'm wrong on that, you can look that up. But the fact that 20 to 26, 27 million Soviets died during the battles and all throughout World War II is just absolutely crazy. So I wanted to read one more passage. This isn't going to be a super long video, but I think all this speaks to the environment that Vladimir Putin grew up in and how he became the madman that he is today. So, and if you like history, this is a good book because it weaves in everything from World War II, 50s, 60s, all the way to the present date, as it's also describing how Vladimir Putin himself has grown up. So this is about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So here's the passage. The United States withdrew its missiles from Europe. Khrushchev recalled the Soviet forces from Cuba, but because at Kennedy's insistence, so of course JFK, Washington's concessions were kept secret, the outcome was seen in Moscow as a humiliation. It looked as if the Soviet Union had backed down without getting anything in return. The economy was faltering too. Far from catching up with America, as Khrushchev had promised, the Soviet Union was falling further behind. So that was interesting to me as well. I think a lot of you guys probably know about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I thought I knew a decent amount about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think there's always so much focus about the missiles in Cuba and the missiles being transported to Cuba and how those ships got sent back. But I think we probably don't think enough about the fact that this was in response to the United States missiles being in Turkey and in Italy. So this was seen as such a huge victory for JFK and the United States, but I didn't realize that it was kept secret on the other side. Now, it would have been seen most likely as a victory either way, but I did not know until reading this book, or maybe I learned it and forgotten it, that the United States pulling our missiles back from Turkey and Italy was not reported. That was done in secret on JFK's insistence, as I just read for you guys, and that was brilliant. But it also speaks to how much of a humiliation that was for the Soviets. And I think a lot of that has to do with what's going on right now. I think Russia now, they're not the superpower that they were post-World War II, obviously. When you look at post-World War II, all through the Red Scare, it was all about the United States stopping communism all over the world. That was pretty much the number one driver of all of our foreign policy. If you go to Vietnam, to Cuba, everything that went on with Latin America. And so the Soviet Union, or Russia, what it became, obviously, but it was always United States and the Soviets. And now in the last 20, 30 years, clearly since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Soviets, Russia, they have been replaced as a superpower by China. So now it's the United States and China. And I think the Russian people feel that. They feel that bruised ego. And Vladimir Putin feels that bruised ego and the lack of nationalism and pride, potentially, that he grew up with when he was growing up in Leningrad in the 50s and the 60s. And I think you can see that with some news that happened recently, with the prisoner exchange that happened last week between Brittany Griner, the WNBA player that the United States gets back in return for Victor Bout, the convicted arms dealer. Victor Bout had served about 14 total years of his sentence. He was going to be released in 2029. Brittany Griner was picked up on a, let's be real, a BS marijuana charge. But the way that was reported, well, here also, a lot of people are saying the United States and Joe Biden did not get a good deal. And I understand if you feel that way. I think that's also an interesting story to look up overall, just kind of all of the prisoners in recent years: Paul Whelan, Trevor Reed, Maria Butina, and Brittany Griner, Victor Bout. It's pretty fascinating what's gone on prisoner exchange-wise the last 3, 4, 5 years, and still trying to get some of these people out. But what I was trying to say was, you have Russia now reporting this as this huge victory, and it was a terrible trade for the United States, and they got back Victor Bout, this arms dealer, and they only gave up Brittany Griner. And I think it's very important for Russia to have those victories, even if it's in the press, and to show people that they're not having one gotten over on them like they did, not just the Cuban Missile Crisis, but what's going on right now. Look at what's going on with the war in Ukraine, where this was supposed to be this blitzkrieg. It was supposed to be over really quickly. It was David versus Goliath, even though, let's be real, David is very well funded by the United States of America. But when you're watching what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, this supposed military superpower, they're a nuclear superpower, they're an energy superpower, but the way they're being held back by little old Ukraine is not going over well, obviously, for pride and ego and nationalism. So anywhere that Russia can get a win, like in this prisoner exchange, whether it's perceived or not, they're going to do their best to try to spin it that way. So if you like history, though, this book is really interesting. Again, it's Putin by Philip Short. I may do some more videos as I learn more about this. And again, you're just kind of learning about the Madman and the environment he grew up in, and why he's doing some of the things he's doing right now, which I think he's trying to rebuild Russian nationalism, and he's trying to go back to the time when the Soviets were super powerful, and there was pride, and they had a lot of territory before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Because other than that, when you look at what he's doing strategically to sacrifice all of these people, all of these troops, what's going to end up being over 100,000 Russian soldiers at least, and Ukrainian soldiers and civilians as well, and all the damage to Ukraine. It just doesn't make any sense for these small portions of land that Russia is trying to take back or occupy. But this guy, man, he's crazy, and he grew up in this era, in this area of Leningrad, where I told you, look what his parents had to do just to survive. Starvation and cannibalism and people attacking and murdering each other for ration cards. That's the city that his parents grew up in, just to be able to survive and give birth to Vladimir Putin 10, 11 years later. So I'm really excited to read more of this book. I'm only about 10% of the way through. And just a couple quick things about Putin so far. It's only covered in what I've read till he's about in college. But small guy, as you know, but a fighter, always has wanted to fight everybody. All of his friends growing up said he wasn't scared of anybody. He was a really good fighter in this discipline called Sambo, which I believe is similar to judo. He was always really good at that as a kid. And it's just now getting into the fact that he's joining so his university and then about to join the KGB. So hopefully there's going to be some really interesting stories about Vladimir Putin in the KGB as I continue this book. Well, if you've liked this video, throw us a like, drop me a comment. What do you think about what's going on in Ukraine, about this Siege of Leningrad, which I didn't know about, Cuban Missile Crisis, all that. What do you think of kind of what I told you about Vladimir Putin? Have you read this book? Any other books that you'd recommend? And what else would you like us to talk about on this channel? We're going to do more. We're going to do more history type videos moving forward, because as I said before, I love history. I've always been a huge fan and student of history. So thanks for watching. Appreciate it. And once again, comment, like, subscribe. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas, everybody. Hope you have a good one. See you soon.